So right now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Lisa Duvall. Lisa is a treasure at the Chamber. She works incredibly hard for us, and we want to recognize everything you do to organize and execute Cider Days. There would be no Cider Days without Lisa, so welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. I'm also a United Way board member, so I'm a hero, at least for that. How many of you went to Cider Days this year? Oh, good. How many of you have never been to Cider Days? How many of you have no idea what Cider Days is? Participants and attendees come to Cider Days from all over the country, even internationally. While some offerings that we have are ticketed, most are free, so we don't really have a good handle on exactly where everyone's from or exactly how many people come, and it's hard to capture their information if they're just showing up. But of the 1,070 tickets that we did sell to the select ticketed events, they came from 21 states: California, Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Washington, Oregon, many states in between. We had attendees from Canada, from authors and presenters from the UK, and 42% of ticket holders came from outside Massachusetts, mostly New England and Mid-Atlantic states. And of the Massachusetts people that came, half of them were they were from Boston area. So the event's website had 15,000 visitors for this past year, and the top city of origin of the people visiting the website in this order were Boston, New York, Greenfield, and Ashburn, Virginia. The hotels are booked, calendars are marked months in advance for this event. It's been featured in Boston media, Yankee Magazine, even the clothing company Land's End wrote a blog entry on it entitled The Best Cider Festival You've Never Heard of. Cider festivals across the country are borrowing aspects of our event. And here we are on the 25th anniversary of Cider Days. It's an event with international presence. It's a mecca for cider makers, aficionados, craft beverage tourists, foodies, cider experts. But Diana and I have been talking that the proprietor a few blocks down from the Chamber never heard of Cider Days. We encounter our neighbors, our friends who don't really know what it is, have never been to it, like many of you have never been to it. So what is all the fuss about this little fall festival? What is it about this festival that was conceived of 25 years ago by Terry and Judith Maloney, Charlie Olchowski, Paul Carenti in a parking lot in Coleraine in the back of their pickup trucks?
Parking lots in Coleraine?
Believe it or not. Why is this event so important to the modern cider movement? How have the advancements here in Franklin County rippled out and forever changed the landscape of cider? Well, we're here to find out. We're here to uncover the mystery for everybody wondering why people are coming from all over the place to this event. We have a great panel here who we know as our friends, our chamber members, our neighbors, but these people here are international cider celebrities. They really are. They have incredibly impressive credentials, which I'm not going to read in the interest of time, but mostly it's because I don't want any of us to walk away with an inferiority complex. They are, if you really want to know, I invite you to patronize their businesses, start a conversation with them, or better yet, join the Cider Days committee, because we always need help. And then you can witness their brilliance unfolding throughout the whole year. And while I'm doing some plugs, we've got Cider Days merch. I'm wearing a large. Anybody? T-shirts. T-shirts, they're comfortable. Tea towels, bags. All right, so first up is Field Maloney. He is from West County Cider, and he'll speak about the origins of the event and reflect on local history, local cider and apple traditions, how his parents' interest in forgotten apples has shifted the apple landscape and birthed the modern cider movement both here and across the country. At least that's what we agreed on, but last night he texted me asking if he could sing, so I'm not entirely I said no, unless it's a duet with me, but, and he never got back to me, so I didn't know quite what to do, so I practiced my favorite song from 1940s, Everything Happens to Me, just in case he wanted to do that one, but he never got back to me, so I'm assuming he's going back to the script that we agreed on. Then there's Ben Clark from Clarkdale Fruit Farm, who is like family to me.
Like a sibling.
Everybody thinks we're siblings. I get people coming up to me in restaurants, "Are you Ben Clark's sister?" Sometimes I say yes if I'm feeling devious. But Ben is going to talk about the history of the family business, continuing agricultural land use, keeping family orchards alive, how cider has contributed to the sustainability of apple growing, and the importance of Cider Days to the region and to his business, and anything else he wants to talk about. And then we have Ben Watson, who is a Cider Days organizer, friend, has become a solid friend. We get together for brunch periodically and kvetch about whatever. He's a cider author and expert. He'll explain why Cider Days has evolved from a small local festival to be a widely respected, internationally known event that is now emulated across the world, and how he started the Cider Salon, and statistics on participation then and now, and why Cider Days is a must-attend event for the cider community. And you have a copy of the tasting guide, salon guide. He compiles that. It's full of descriptions such as apples on the orchard floor layered over aroma of toffee, dust, beeswax, and hay lead to a muscular and embracing mid-palate with flavors of ripe red apple, wild mint, and something animalistic. The finish is an interplay between sweet and bitter, the leathery tannins full and present amidst ripe fruit and brown sugar. So, here they are.
Should have worn a cape, but left it in the car. My name's Field Maloney. I'm the LLC manager of West County Cider. And as Lisa said, I'm going to just talk for a little bit about West County and cider and Cider Days. So, West County was started in 1984, which makes us now, I believe, 35 years old, or the company 35 years old. When we started, there were no cider companies in the country, but there had been, back in the 1800s, there'd been a robust tradition of cider making in apples, and sort of an interesting thing about cider is it was in the colonial era, it was the dominant alcoholic drink. That people drank more cider than beer or whiskey. Around the Civil War was the point where cider became overtaken by beer and whiskey as the main American drink, and that's partly because after the Civil War we became much more industrial as a country, and cider was part of our more agrarian, because people had trees and they wanted to figure out a way to use up all their apples and to make some booze for the winter. So that was the origins of, I think, hard cider. I mean, I think people will figure out a way to ferment anything. I mean, I've read in prisons there's a drink called Pruno where people take raspberry or donuts and like sugar packets and they hide it under there and let it ferment. So, I mean, the urge to ferment has always been but our sort of way into fermentation was well, my father was actually a doctor, ER doctor at Franklin County, now Bay State Franklin, for about 25 years. And when he was in medical school in San Francisco in the late 60s, people were just starting to make wine out there around Napa. I mean, but Napa then was sort of like cider 10 years. I mean, it was still very, it wasn't a known quantity to Americans. Sort of the wine and cider industry, wine had been really hit hard since Prohibition, cider before Prohibition, but also by Prohibition. So anyway, he started making wine, he and my mother. They knew a guy who planted a dairy farm in Carneros to grapes, and then they started fermenting cider with their friends, or a wine, and then and then moved to Franklin County, and there was this tradition of apple growing and apples, but no one was making cider except for all the growers in the hills were still making cider for themselves, but cider had sort of totally vanished. No one knew about cider in the late 70s, early 80s. So their thing was, we can't grow grapes here, but what about trying to use the richness of the apples grown around here? And the apples around here, I think one could fairly say, are the best in the country, or of the best in the country. There's something specific to these hillsides that produces very flavorful apples. And so it was basically this lost art. I think for my father, partly as the scientific side appealed to him of fermentation. So the idea was, let's try to make cider from apples from these hills with using the techniques of scientific winemaking. So we started, and that was, again, in '84. For a long time in the '80s, it was very hard to get anyone to think of cider. It was sort of a niche market without a niche. And I think my parents, by sort of stubbornness and belief in cider, kept going despite it being, you felt like you were sort of crying in the wilderness, cider, cider. And that was, I think, the beginning of CiderDays. Partly was there were a group of people, the people that and others that Lisa mentioned, that were like, how can we start getting people to think about the richness of apples in this county? And so it started as this very small thing, and but I think, like, for this commerce, one interesting thing about CiderDays to me is that it was always larger than one person or one. So rather than being an event where it all happened in one place, it was always about happening at all the orchards. So like Clarkdale very early on, or Pine Hill. And it was a way not just of having people come to a tent and drink, but having people explore the richness. I mean, in a way, it's a little bit like Crafts of Coleraine, but it's sort of grown up to be a much, much larger thing. But I think that there was something special. Part of the sort of DNA that made CiderDays work was it wasn't just one person. It was always all volunteer, so it never got to be shaped. And it also was about really exploring Franklin County rather than being focused on a narrow, like just people drinking under a tent, even though that of course is a big part of Cider Days too. Anyway, Cider Days sort of grown up and left the house. Cider has sort of grown up and left the house. I mean, now it's, far bigger. I would say far bigger than like my father would have ever imagined, but I think the truth is that partly why he stuck by it, and my mother stuck by it, and I've stuck by it, is there was a belief in it as both from this thing from the past that had been forgotten, and that someday people would start to recognize it. So in a way, I think though, and my father died 10 years ago, but so while all this was happening, but I think that in a way, it both would have surprised him that now that cider's grown to this big thing in Cider Days, but I also think that it would have made, it was something he thought was going to happen. He was always wondering why it didn't happen earlier. So it's great. It's great. It's happening. And I just want to say, to wrap up, that I think the feeling of Cider Day, even as it's grown up, it stayed a volunteer thing, and it stayed something that, embraces many orchards and and I think that somehow it's not lost the things that have made it neat to begin with, even as it's grown. So I think that's always a challenge for these kind of things. And I would also say that having the chamber sort of come in, which was what Ann Hamilton was sort of brought it into the fold of the chamber, and that allowed it had sort of grown more than any small group of individuals could do, and has really shepherded it in a way that makes it more a larger thing than just this is one company's event or one, and so it really belongs to the county, even though it brings people out, from outside of it. So that's cool. Anyway, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ben Clark, Clarkdale Fruit Farms in Deerfield. I'm joined by my father, Tom, as well. I'm the fourth generation at our farm. My father's the third generation. We run the farm together. And I'm fortunate that our farm has been around since 1915, and we've been established here. And cider has been a part of our operations since about the 50s, early 60s, when my grandfather started pressing. And we still are pressing cider, the same style. We have new equipment. Back then it was laminated wooden, actually maybe not even laminated originally, just wooden presses. It was much more of a small town farm thing, which over the years with food safety and everything else, we've upgraded. Now we have everything stainless steel. Everything is up to spec because it needs to be, but it doesn't change how we're doing it. We're still pressing the same style with choice apples and anyways, Cider Days. I was only 16 when Cider Days started, and to be honest, I don't remember it. I was a high school kid and probably pressed into helping out at the farm, but my father, we were driving down. He was recounting some of his memories. Is that he knew Charlie and Paul and Judith and Terry, and they had this idea of, Paul wrote a book, The Art of Cider Making, and as Field had said, at the time cider making was not a known thing. I mean, they really were struggling to get this out there, and nobody really knew what was happening. So it was a great way of promoting cider, and as Field was mentioning, the apples and the diversity of apples and the really special growing climate we have here in the Northeast. And so my father said, he said, yeah, we had people at the farm, somebody made some signs up. They had maybe a minimal bump in business. It wasn't like it is today. I mean, you can imagine putting ads in the paper and trying to get people just locally aware of what was happening. And it's amazing, over my time, I've been back for 13 years on the farm now, and since I've been back, just the amazing growth. And as Field mentioned, I mean, it was about 10 or 12 years ago when the cider movement really started to pick up steam. I mean, it was everybody knows about the microbreweries with beer, how that Sam Adams started out. They were like the first microbrewery in the U.S. in modern time, and now they're this monster company that everybody else has followed along. Cider was a similar thing of nobody really knew it was happening. It's taken off, and really thanks to the Maloneys, they were really the first folks doing it. And now you have Peter Mitchell's here, Headwater Cider, one of many cideries in the county who have come along since Cider Days, and I think Peter would agree that's really helped getting us on the map and getting people aware of cider and making it available for others to come on board. We now have Bear Swamp, Bear Meadow, Headwater. Those are just here in New Salem, and then there's also Cars Cider in Hadley. There's a few others I'm probably forgetting, but Artifact Cider. So this really has been, a lot of these have come along in the last dozen years, and it really does. It's an economy. We're not doing hard cider ourselves. We do sweet cider. We do apples and peaches and other fruits, and we run our retail stand, which is our primary source of income. But it really, Cider Days, as my father had said, initially it really wasn't anything. You wouldn't have noticed it was any different day on that first day that it happened, and it really was the volunteerism and the sticking to it and trying to make this a thing. It was originally Cider Day. There was just one day, Saturday, because why have 2 days when nobody knows what's happening anyways? And I remember that we actually changed years ago. We changed it. We started to do more things on Sundays, and then he said, well, we should change it to Cider Days, make it a weekend. And now it's actually, with this year, with the 25th, it was the most events that we've ever had. There was a pre-tour that we weren't really involved with, but a group that put together a pre-tour, basically went through the Northeast cideries. They did a bus tour on Thursday. Friday there were events, and then obviously Saturday and Sunday. So it brings a lot of people in, and as Lisa said, it does bring a lot of people in. We don't have numbers either of what it is, but we can say that consistently our best sales day of the year is Saturday of Cider Days. We make extra cider. There's some blends today. We do pear cider. We do some different vintage cider blends that a lot of people come up and they want to get it not just for drinking but for home fermentation. So that's one thing that people come, and just like Peter and these other guys, you start out small in your basement, just like West County did, has grown on to sell all over the country, and there's still a lot of people who are starting out at home, and I mean, countless producers, as Ben could attest to, that have come out of Cider Days. Bantam Cider being one that I can think of out of Boston, which some people might have heard of. And it really has become a sort of an incubator for the cider industry, and it's launched the U.S. Cider Makers Association really came out of Cider Days, which is now a nationwide collective, and there's different pockets, different cider conventions happening, which all came out of us. And we are the longest running continuous cider celebration, but still maintaining the feel of it's not a massive corporate thing, which happens in New York and other places. We still are true to Franklin County roots. Is we sort of cap it at a certain size of the salon has gotten bigger every year. We have 2 sessions of 300 people, maybe more than 300 people at a time. Which that's the largest tent that we can get from the tent rental. So we're not going to get any bigger because we don't want to have it at the Big E or somewhere else. And we've had this conversation over the years that we want to maintain, the true character of it. And people come out to the orchards. All the orchards benefit in the county. And the businesses, restaurants. I mean, Hope and Olive I was talking to, they were slammed. Other places in Turner's, the hotels are all booked. So it really does become a great driver. And this year, Keiko Oral, who's the head of Mass Tourism, came out, and Diana took her around because they're aware that it is, and we do get money for the chamber. So just that it brings in a lot of people, it's an economic driver, and it's just been a great thing, and it's benefited our farm along with all the others in the area. And I just have 1 minute, so I'll wrap up. But I would just say I would encourage. I mean, it seemed like most people have heard about Cider Days, even if you haven't been to it. It is a great event. I also know that some people actually, our regular customers, will avoid, just to say avoid, especially the Saturday, because they know that it's going to be a zoo. It's great. We get a lot of people in, but we also it's a lot of staffing, and it works out. But we're certainly happy with the business. But generally, people will come. We do our special cider blends just for that weekend, so people will come either on Friday or on Sunday. If you're sort of in the know, then but the salon and other things, which are really unique events, and I would encourage people, those always sell out, as Ben will speak to, the number of producers that you get in, number of other cider enthusiasts. There are so many other great free workshops which happen, which it's really been a benefit for the county and for our business. And I thank the chamber especially Ann, for getting it organized, and Lisa now has really been amazing at keeping it going, and sort of herding cats at times, but it's great. So thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am a sort of an adopted Franklin County person. I actually live in the Monadnock region, way up over the border in New Hampshire. But I think I have some claim to be here and talking to you folks, because I've been involved not only with Cider Days for a long time, but I first met the Maloneys, Terry and Judith, and I think Field too, although he might have been away at school at the time. But back in the 1980s, as far along as I was trying to remember the exact year, it might be 88, that I first met them, and somebody said, hey, you should stop by and check out this at that time it was called West County Winery, because they were making fruit wines too, as well as a couple of ciders. And so we sort of struck up an acquaintance and eventually a friendship, and I also was working for Yankee Publishing up in Dublin, New Hampshire. And I wrote a couple of articles so I got to know the Deerfield River Valley very well in this area. I wrote a couple of articles over the years I wrote one on the hill towns of Route 8A, because at that time Route 8A was the worst road in Massachusetts, and that's why I decided to write about it. I wrote this New England about the hill towns of Route 8A, and I spent some time out in West Hawley harvesting potatoes and visiting various people along the route. And then I did a big article a few years later on the Deerfield River, called the hardest working river in New England. And I got to go to the nuclear power plant and stuff like that in a row. So I was quite familiar with the area. But in terms of Cider Days, I started coming here in the 1990s to Cider Days when it was still a small event. So I remember some of the origins that Field went into and Ben went into. And it was really an intimate sort of an event, and it was a lot of, focused on people who were making their own cider traditionally at home, and they would come out, and it was a little bit of a geeky thing, and you'd park your pickup truck. Yeah, it kind of is. We've retained that piece of it. But people would park the pickup truck in the field. It wasn't really a parking lot, but a field in Coleraine, and would sort of put down the back of the pickup and would say, "You want to try some of my elderberry mead? Yeah, why not?" So everybody was learning at the time, but I was also writing a book at the time, which is still in print after 20 years. It's going to its third edition, called Cider Hard and Sweet, and I was doing research, which involves drinking, of course. Yeah, but I came down and started to attend Cider Days every year, and so saw how it's developed over time, and then eventually got involved, got pulled into the organizing part of it too. And I made a prediction at the time. My book was supposed to be about apples originally, and somebody wrote another book about apples that came out. And my publisher, I said, well, I need a lot more money because I have to go to Kazakhstan because I want to visit the origin of center of diversity of apples. And they went, yeah, we're not going to give you that money. And I said, well, I got another idea. Well, let's turn the book into a book on cider, because I think, I said, in my usual naive, overconfident way, I said, I think that cider, I see this as being a big deal, and it's growing organically now, but you just wait, because it's going to explode. And I like to say to people, it's the one prediction I've ever made in my life that has been proven true. It took about 5 or 10 years, which, as with most of my books, I'm about 5 or 10 years ahead of anybody else caring about the subject, so they never sell very well. But it was a great experience, and it was proven true that it took some time and it grew slowly, and cider is still a small moat on the backside of the whole beverage industry, but it's grown some years, in the early years, it was growing at more than 100% growth year over year, the cider industry nationwide. But these guys have really covered a lot of great material and given you an insight into the origins of CiderDays. I'll just mention that another thing that I did was back in 2006, I suggested to Terry Maloney, I said, well, why don't we do, there seem to be more commercial producers around the country. Because at that time, when I was doing my research for the book, there were maybe generously 24 people making cider in the United States commercially, by my estimate. And now there are easily over 1,000 cideries across the country, people making cider commercially. But I said at the time, when there was still fairly few, why don't we have, in addition to the home cider making and the educational aspects that we've always done, how about if we do an event where we do an open tasting? Wouldn't it be fun to get, and maybe attract some producers to come to CiderDays too? And he said, that's a great idea. You get to do it. You get to organize it. Terry said, thanks, Terry. And so our first, Lisa presented a lot of statistics early, which is great to give you a sense of the scope of where people come from and how big it's gotten. But the salon started in 2008, I believe, and this year I went back and I took a look at. We've always done this. The salon guide that you have in front of you right now has gotten to be kind of a monster to put together every year, but it's 20-some pages now. But when it started out, we had 13 producers who contributed, not necessarily even coming to it, but contributed cider to the event, and there were, I think, 25 brands listed in that first salon guide. And this year, I calculated that we had 52 producers, most of whom attended. There were very few, 3 or 4 only, who didn't come of those, that were represented, and there were over 130 brands of cider and Perry, or pear cider, that were at the salon this year. So we've quadrupled the number of, well, we haven't, but I mean, there are quadrupled the number of producers involved in CiderDays now, and we've over 5 times the number of brands that are available. And yet, the challenges are always to try to retain the specialness and the origins and be true to what CiderDays has always been, and also accommodate this tremendous interest that we see every year. And as Ben said, we limit it. We're limited by the space constrictions that we have, and frankly, what we want to do. I mean, we have 2 sessions at the salon, and we do them for an hour and a half, and people sometimes say, well, that's not enough time to try all the ciders. And I'm like, yeah, that's sort of the point. We don't want you drinking 130 samples of cider and wrapping yourself around a telephone pole. And thank God we've never had that problem at CiderDays. We've always maintained a good control over it, and I think that's one reason, because it's a limited amount of time, and we control it fairly well. It's a unique event, the salon, and as Lisa said, it has been emulated other places. Most recently, about a year or 2 ago, I learned that they were doing a series of things called, nobody had come up, this cider salon was something that I coined the name, and people said, oh, that's an interesting name. Well, now they're doing several of them in England, And I sent a note over to my friend Tom Oliver, who's one of the best cider makers in England, who was promoting this. And I said, am I getting a royalty? Am I getting a residual off of the use of the name Cider Salon? I should have trademarked it, damn it. It's seen as a model for how to run a festival without doing something that is often done in the West Country of England, where they grow a lot of apples, and it's the traditional apple growing region over there. There they have problems with, because they have more traditional kind of drinking festivals. CiderDays isn't a drinking festival. It's a sampling and educational festival and an agricultural celebration that people like to drink at. But over there, you might buy a pint or a half a pint, and you might have to wait 2 hours or an hour and a half in line just to be able to do that. And that's never something that we wanted to do when we were conceiving this whole thing. We don't want to be a drinking festival. We're a complete event, and it's really to celebrate the culture, the historic culture, and the resurgence and the renaissance of cider in the region. And I think we've done that. In terms of the people who've come over the years, we've had a couple of people from Sweden who've come before. We've had several people from Australia who've come in. So it does have an international reputation among people who are really into the whole cider culture around the world, which has grown phenomenally. So we encourage you to promote it to people around here locally and to help support it. I mean, I think it benefits the merchants and the businesses in the area for this one weekend of the year, but also it brings a spotlight to Franklin County and the unique terroir landscape and agricultural history and practices that are being done here. And it's a special place in the world, and people deserve to know about that. So
What weekend is it then? We forgot to say.
it is always the first weekend in November. So it's a movable date, but it's always the first full weekend in November. So next year it'll be the 7th, I think, 7th and 8th. I think it's about as late as it can get next year. This year was about as early as it can get. But anyway, thank you very much for
Again with us. I think the step stool suggestion was a good one.
It's an apple box.
Yeah,
It's gonna-
there we go, there we go. I was flipping through the salon tasting notes, and the first cidery was Aaron Burr Cidery, and I'm like, it's a good time. That's a vice president that shot a guy, so it's gonna be interesting there. Let's see, where are we? So thank you, Lisa, for putting this panel together. Thank you, everybody. Ben, thank you for coming and putting us on the map and making us a leader in cider production throughout the country and the world.
Now the